Billionaire CEO accidentally sees his innocent maid's secret and becomes attracted. The crystal vase shattered against the marble floor, sending fragments across the pristine kitchen like scattered diamonds. Elena froze, her hands trembling as she stared at the destruction. Not just any vase, the Lalique crystal that Mr. Blackwood's grandmother had left him, the one he'd specifically told the staff never to touch. No, 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 she whispered, dropping to her knees, frantically trying to gather the pieces as if she could somehow put them back together. Blood welled on her palm where a shard cut deep, but she barely noticed. All she could think about was losing this job, the only thing keeping her little brother in school and their grandmother's medical bills paid. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her heart stop. It was past midnight. Mr. Blackwood should have been asleep. But there he was, Alexander Blackwood himself, standing in the doorway in pajama bottoms and a t-shirt, looking nothing like the ruthless CEO who graced magazine covers. "I'm so sorry," Elena burst out, tears streaming down her face. "I'll pay for it. I'll work for free. You're bleeding," he said quietly. And before she could process what was happening, he was kneeling beside her, gently taking her injured hand. But before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you love stories about unexpected connections and life-changing moments, make sure to hit that subscribe button. 6 months earlier, Elena Reyes had answered the job posting with desperation born of necessity. 23 years old with a high school diploma and a resume full of minimum wage jobs, she wasn't exactly what most billionaires looked for in household staff. But Mrs. Chen, the house manager, had taken one look at her and hired her on the spot. "You have honest eyes," Mrs. Chen had said simply. "That's rarer than you'd think in this business." The Blackwood mansion was like something from a movie. 30 rooms, gardens that required a full-time staff, art worth more than Elena would make in 10 lifetimes. And at the center of it all was Alexander Blackwood, 35, single, and according to every gossip magazine in the country, utterly unattainable. Elena had seen him exactly 3 times in her first month. Once in the hallway, where he'd nodded absently. Once in his study, where she'd delivered coffee and he hadn't looked up from his computer. Once in the garden, where she'd caught him staring at the sunset with such profound sadness that she'd wanted to ask if he was okay. She hadn't, of course. Maids didn't talk to billionaires. They cleaned their houses, washed their clothes, and remained invisible. That was the rule, and Elena was very good at following rules. What Alexander Blackwood didn't know was that his newest maid went home every night to a cramped apartment where she became someone entirely different, where she tucked her little brother Diego into bed with stories about brave knights and clever princesses, where she helped her grandmother with medications that cost more than their rent, where she sat at a second-hand keyboard and lost herself in music that no one else would ever hear. Music was Elena's secret, had been since she was 7, and found an abandoned piano in their church basement. The pastor had let her practice in exchange for cleaning, and she'd discovered she had a gift, not just for playing but for composing, for taking the chaos of life and turning it into something beautiful. She'd had a scholarship once to study at the conservatory, but then her parents died in a car accident, and suddenly she was 18 with a 13-year-old brother and a grandmother who'd given up everything to raise them. The scholarship couldn't pay for food or rent or insulin. So Elena had done what she'd always done. She'd survived. But late at night, when Diego was asleep and her grandmother's breathing was steady, Elena would put on her headphones and play. She'd compose symphonies on a keyboard with half the keys sticking, pouring her heart into melodies that lived only in her computer. It was her escape, her joy, her secret self that had nothing to do with being invisible or being poor or being practical. The night of the broken vase changed everything. Alexander had been having his usual insomnia, wandering his empty mansion like a ghost. He'd built this life through sheer force of will, turning his father's failing company into a global empire. But success, he'd learned, was a cold bedfellow. At 35, he had everything and nothing. Money that felt meaningless, a mansion that echoed with loneliness, and a reputation for being brilliant but unreachable. He'd been heading to the kitchen for water when he heard the crash. Then he'd seen her. Elena, the quiet maid with the gentle smile on her knees among the ruins of his grandmother's vase, crying like her world was ending. "Let me see," he said, taking her hand carefully. The cut was deep, but clean. "We need to clean this." "The vase," Elena whispered. "I'm so sorry. I know it was precious to you." Alexander looked at the shattered crystal, then at the young woman who was shaking with fear. "It's just a thing," he said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. "Things can be replaced, people can't." He led her to the bathroom, found the first aid kit, and carefully cleaned and bandaged her hand. Eleanor watched in stunned silence as one of the richest men in the world tended to her injury with surprising gentleness. "Why were you here so late?" he asked as he worked. I take extra shifts when I can," Elena admitted. "Mrs. Chen doesn't mind, and I need—" She stopped, embarrassed. "You need the money," Alexander finished. It wasn't a question. He'd grown up poor himself, before his father's invention had changed their lives. He recognized the look of someone working themselves to exhaustion just to survive. "My brother's school fees are due," Eleanor said quietly, "and my grandmother's medications." "I'm sorry. You don't need to hear this. How old is your brother?" 13. He's brilliant. Wants to be an engineer." Pride crept into her voice. "He's got a full scholarship for high school, but there are still books and uniforms and you're paying for all of it," Alexander said, securing the bandage. "What about your parents?" "They died 5 years ago." The simple statement hung between them. Alexander looked at her properly for the first time. Really looked. She was beautiful in an understated way, with dark hair pulled back severely, and brown eyes that held depths of strength and sorrow. But more than that, there was something about her that felt real. In his world of pretense and power plays, she was startlingly genuine. "I should go," Eleanor said, standing quickly. "I'll leave my information for the vase. I can pay in installments." "You'll do no such thing," Alexander interrupted. "It was an accident, and frankly, I never liked that vase. Too ostentatious." Elena stared at him. "But you said it was your grandmother's." "She had terrible taste," Alexander said with a small smile. "I kept it out of guilt, not love. You've done me a favor." It was a lie, and they both knew it. But Elena saw something in his eyes, a kindness she hadn't expected from a man known for hostile takeovers and ruthless negotiations. "Thank you," she whispered. "Elena," he said as she turned to leave. She froze, surprised he knew her name. "No more late nights alone. If you need extra hours, work during the day when others are here. It's safer." She nodded and fled, her bandaged hand throbbing in time with her racing heart. Alexander stood in his kitchen for a long time after she left, staring at the blood-stained crystal on the floor. He'd had 100 employees over the years, but none had ever apologized with such genuine distress. None had ever made him want to know their story. He should have left it at that. Should have gone back to bed and forgotten about the pretty maid with the injured hand and the weight of the world on her shoulders. But Alexander Blackwood hadn't built an empire by ignoring his instincts, and his instincts were telling him there was more to Elena Reyes than met the eye. The next day, he did something he'd never done before. He asked Mrs. Chen about a member of the household staff. "Elena? She's wonderful," Mrs. Chen said, clearly surprised by his interest. "Never complains, always on time, treats this house like it's her own." "Why do you ask?" "She seems overqualified for this work," Alexander said carefully. Mrs. Chen's expression softened. "Life doesn't always give us the chances we deserve, Mr. Blackwood. Elena's had more responsibility than most people twice her age, but she handles it with grace." That evening, Alexander found himself in his study, unable to concentrate on the merger documents that needed his attention. Instead, he kept thinking about Elena's eyes when she'd talked about her brother. The pride mixed with exhaustion. The way she'd tried to gather the broken pieces like she could fix everything through sheer determination. He made a decision that would have shocked his board of directors. He called his head of HR. "I want you to create a scholarship program," he said, "for employees' families, full coverage for educational expenses. That's generous, sir. Any particular reason? Good business, Alexander said curtly. Happy employees are productive employees. But as he hung up, he knew it wasn't about business at all. Elena heard about the scholarship program a week later, along with the rest of the staff. Mrs. Chen made the announcement at the monthly meeting, and Elena felt her knees go weak. Full coverage for employees' families, Diego's books, uniforms, everything, covered. She excused herself to the bathroom and cried tears of relief so intense they made her shake. For the first time in 5 years, she could breathe. She could stop taking extra shifts. She could maybe even save a little for her grandmother's care. "It's like a miracle," she told her grandmother that night. "I can't believe Mr. Blackwood would do something like this." Her grandmother, wise from 8 decades of living, smiled knowingly. Perhaps someone reminded him that money is only valuable when it helps people. Eleanor wanted to thank him, but Alexander had become even more elusive since the night of the broken vase. She caught glimpses of him sometimes, entering his study, leaving for work at dawn, standing on his balcony late at night, like a lonely king surveying an empty kingdom. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Thursday, and Elena had stayed late to prepare for a board meeting the next day. The house was hosting 20 executives for dinner, and everything had to be perfect. She was alone in the mansion except for security, the other staff having gone home hours ago. She was polishing silver in the dining room when she heard it, piano music drifting from somewhere in the house. But not just any piano music. It was her composition, the piece she'd written for Diego's birthday, the one she'd never played for anyone but him. Heart-pounding, she followed the sound to the conservatory, a glass-walled room she'd never entered before. There was a grand piano inside, and at it sat Alexander Blackwood playing her music with a skill that made her forget to breathe. He played with his eyes closed, completely lost in the melody. His fingers moved across the keys with a passion she'd never associated with the cold businessman, and he was playing her song, note for note, exactly as she'd written it. The final note hung in the air like a question. Alexander opened his eyes and saw her standing in the doorway, frozen like a deer in headlights. "How?" was all Elena could manage. Alexander's face flushed, the first time she'd ever seen him anything less than perfectly composed. I can explain." "That's my song," Elena whispered. "I wrote it for my brother. No one else has ever heard it. How are you playing my song?" Alexander stood slowly, running a hand through his hair. "Last week, after you left, you dropped something, a USB drive." Eleanor's hand flew to her pocket, where she kept the drive with all her compositions, her backup, her lifeline, her secret world. "I should have just returned it," Alexander continued, looking genuinely distressed. "But it was labeled Dreams, and I was curious. I'm sorry. I know it was a violation of privacy." "You listened to my music." "I listened to your soul," Alexander said quietly. "Elena, these compositions, they're extraordinary. Why are you cleaning houses when you could be performing in concert halls?" Elena laughed, but it was bitter. "Because concert halls don't pay for insulin or rent or food. Because I had a scholarship once but life happened. Because some of us don't get to chase dreams." "You had a scholarship? Where?" "The Manhattan Conservatory, full ride for composition and performance." The words hurt to say. "I was 3 weeks from starting when my parents died." Alexander moved toward her, and Elena saw something in his eyes she'd never expected. Understanding. "How long have you been composing?" "Since I was 7. Despite everything, Elena found herself answering honestly. It's how I make sense of the world. When everything else is chaos, music makes sense." "Play for me," Alexander said suddenly. "What?" "Play for me, please. I've heard your compositions through speakers, but I want to hear them live, the way they're meant to be heard." Eleanor looked at the grand piano, an instrument worth more than she'd make in years. "I couldn't. I clean your house. I'm not supposed to touch—" "You're an artist," Alexander interrupted, "and this piano has been silent for too long. Please." Something in his voice made her move forward. She sat at the bench, her fingers trembling as they touched keys that were perfectly tuned, perfectly weighted. Nothing like her sticky keyboard at home. She played the first piece she'd ever written, a simple melody she'd composed for her mother's birthday when she was 8. Then she played the lullaby she'd written for Diego when he had nightmares, the funeral march she'd composed but never played after her parents died. The joy she'd captured the day her grandmother's test results came back negative. She played her life, and Alexander listened like a man in prayer. When she finished, there were tears on both their faces. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Alexander asked. "Mrs. Chen, the other staff. No one knows about this." "Because it doesn't matter," Eleanor said, wiping her eyes. "This is my reality." She gestured to her uniform. "That's just dreams." "What if it didn't have to be?" Eleanor looked at him sharply. "Please don't. I don't need pity or charity. The scholarship program is already more than—" "I'm not talking about charity," Alexander said. "I'm talking about justice. Eleanor, you have a gift that the world should hear. What if I could help make that happen? Why would you do that?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment. "Because I know what it's like to have a dream that seems impossible. Because I built my empire on the belief that talent should be rewarded, not wasted. And because—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "Because in all my success I've forgotten what it feels like to be moved by something beautiful. Your music reminded me." Eleanor stared at him. This billionaire who played her compositions in secret, who bandaged her wounds and created scholarships, and looked at her like she was precious instead of invisible. "I can't accept—" "Then don't accept," Alexander said. "Earn it. Compose for me. Play for me. Let me sponsor your return to the conservatory, and in exchange give me the privilege of watching your gift flourish. You want me to be your personal musician?" "I want you to be yourself," Alexander corrected. "Just where I can witness it." It was an insane proposition, inappropriate on every level. But Elena thought about Diego's face when she'd told him about the scholarship, thought about her grandmother's medications, thought about the music trapped inside her, begging for release. "I have conditions," she heard herself say. Alexander's lips twitched. "Of course you do. I keep working. I won't be a kept woman or a charity case. I work for my wages." "Agreed. My family doesn't know, not until I'm sure I can do this, if that's what you want. And you—" Elena took a breath. "You have to play too. Music isn't meant to be experienced alone." Alexander's eyes widened. "I haven't played for anyone since my mother died." "Then we're even," Elena said. "Two people with music they've kept secret, sharing it together." "You're negotiating with me," Alexander said, and he sounded delighted. "No one negotiates with me." "Maybe that's your problem," Elena said, then immediately covered her mouth. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" Alexander laughed, a real laugh that transformed his face. "No, you're right. It is my problem. One of many." He extended his hand. "Partners." Elena looked at his hand, the same one that had tenderly bandaged hers. "This is crazy." "The best things usually are." She shook his hand and something electric passed between them. Not just attraction, though that was there too. Recognition. Two souls that had been playing solo finally finding a duet partner. What followed were the strangest and most wonderful months of Elena's life. During the day, she continued her work as a maid, keeping their arrangement secret from everyone except Mrs. Chen, who was brought into confidence out of necessity. But 3 evenings a week, after the other staff had gone home, Eleanor would meet Alexander in the conservatory. At first it was awkward. She was hyper-aware of the gulf between them, employer and employee, billionaire and maid, powerful and powerless. But music, Elena discovered, was a great equalizer. When they sat at the piano together, they were just two people who understood the language of melody and harmony. Alexander was a skilled pianist, classically trained from childhood, but where his playing was technically perfect, it lacked soul, until Eleanor began teaching him to play with his heart instead of his head. "You're thinking too much," she told him one evening, as he struggled with one of her compositions. "Music isn't math. You can't solve it. You have to feel it." "I'm not good at feeling," Alexander admitted, his hands still on the keys. "Why did you stop playing? After your mother died?" Alexander was quiet for so long, Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. She was the only one who ever heard me play just for joy. My father saw it as a waste of time. The board sees everything as either an asset or a liability. After she died, there didn't seem to be a point. There's always a point, Elena said softly. Music doesn't need an audience to matter. Sometimes we play just to remind ourselves we're alive. That night, Alexander played a piece Elena had never heard before, a composition of his own written when he was 17 and his mother was dying of cancer. It was raw and painful and beautiful, and when he finished, Elena was crying. "I've never played that for anyone," he said quietly. "Thank you for trusting me with it," Elena whispered. Their sessions became about more than music. They talked as they played, sharing pieces of themselves along with melodies. Elena learned that Alexander's ruthless business persona was armor, protecting a man who'd learned early that showing weakness invited attack. Alexander discovered that Elena's quiet strength came from surviving losses that would have broken most people. "Do you ever regret it?" Alexander asked one night. "Giving up your scholarship?" "How can I regret choosing my family?" Elena replied. "But do I wonder what might have been? Every day." "You'll go back," Alexander said with such certainty it made her chest tight. "I'll make sure of it." "You can't fix everything with money," Elena said gently. "No," Alexander agreed, "but I can remove the obstacles that money creates. The rest, the talent, the passion, the dedication, that's all you." Slowly, Elena began to believe it might be possible. Alexander had connections at the conservatory, and they were willing to accept her delayed enrollment. With the salary from her job and Alexander's sponsorship, she could afford to study part-time while still supporting her family. But as the weeks passed, another complication arose. One neither of them had anticipated. They were falling in love. It happened gradually, in moments between notes, the way Alexander's face lit up when he mastered a difficult passage. How Elena unconsciously leaned into him when they played duets, the lingering glances, the accidental touches that became less accidental over time. Elena tried to ignore it. Falling for her employer was a cliché she refused to embrace. She'd worked too hard to be independent to become the kind of woman who needed a rich man to save her. Alexander fought it too, for different reasons. He'd seen how power imbalances destroyed relationships. He wouldn't be the man who took advantage of someone who depended on him for income. But music has a way of revealing truth, and the pieces they played together became increasingly intimate. Love songs crept into their repertoire, compositions that spoke of longing and desire and connection. The tension came to a head on a rainy Thursday evening. They were playing a duet Elena had written, a conversation between two instruments that circled each other, came together, pulled apart, and finally united in perfect harmony. As the last note faded, they turned to each other, and the air between them crackled with everything unsaid. "Elena," Alexander breathed, his hand reaching for her face. "Don't," she whispered, even as she leaned into his touch. "We can't. I work for you. People would say, I don't care what people say." "I do," Elena said firmly, pulling back though it physically hurt. "I've worked too hard to be seen as someone who earned her place. If this happens, I'll always be the maid who seduced her boss. Your world will never see me as anything else." Alexander's hand dropped. "You're right. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." "I feel it too," Elena admitted, needing him to know. "But feeling it and acting on it are different things. At least for now." "For now?" Alexander asked, hope creeping into his voice. "Until I'm not your employee. Until I'm at the conservatory and standing on my own feet. Then—" Elena managed a small smile. "Then ask me again." Alexander nodded slowly. "I can wait. You're worth waiting for." They returned to the piano, but everything had changed. The music they made was charged with promise and restraint, desire carefully controlled, but never denied. 2 weeks later, Elena's acceptance to the conservatory arrived. She was starting in the fall, with a modified schedule that would allow her to work part-time and attend classes. It was everything she'd dreamed of, 5 years delayed, but not destroyed. She found Alexander in his study that evening, staring out at the city lights. "I got in," she said simply. He turned, and the joy on his face took her breath away. "Of course you did. They'd be fools not to accept you." "This is really happening," Eleanor said wonderingly. "I'm going to study music. I'm going to compose. I'm going to—" "You're going to change the world," Alexander finished, one beautiful song at a time. They stood there, feet apart but hearts connected, both knowing that everything was about to change. "I'll need to give notice," Elena said. "Find a replacement." "Already taken care of," Alexander said. "Mrs. Chen has been interviewing candidates. She knows you're meant for bigger things." "You told her?" "She figured it out. Something about the way I smiled after our sessions." Alexander's expression grew serious. "Eleanor, I need you to know something. What I feel for you has nothing to do with your music. That's your gift to the world. What I feel is about you. Your strength, your kindness, your terrible jokes about composers." Elena laughed wetly. "They're not terrible. They're awful. But I love them. I love—" He stopped himself. "Sorry, I promised to wait." "2 more weeks," Elena said. 2 weeks until I'm officially no longer your employee." "I'm counting the days," Alexander admitted. Those 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparations. Elena trained her replacement, a young woman named Rosa, who reminded her of herself, hard-working and desperate for a chance. She registered for classes, bought textbooks with money she'd saved, and tried not to think about how her life was about to split wide open. Her last day as Alexander's maid was a Friday. The house felt different as she moved through it one final time, no longer as an employee, but as someone saying goodbye to a chapter of her life. She found Alexander in the conservatory, sitting at the piano but not playing. "I have something for you," he said, pulling out a wrapped package. Inside was sheet music, but not just any sheet music. It was her compositions, professionally transcribed and bound in leather. "Your first portfolio," Alexander explained, "for when you're a famous composer and people want to see your early work." Eleanor clutched the book to her chest, overwhelmed. "Alexander." "There's more," he said, looking uncharacteristically nervous. He pulled out a second package, smaller this time. "This one comes with a question." Inside was a simple silver necklace with a single charm, a piano key. "Elena Reyes," Alexander said formally, "would you go on a date with me? A real date where I pick you up at your door and we go somewhere public and I try to impress you with my knowledge of music history." "Your knowledge of music history is terrible," Elena said through tears. "I know, that's why I need a tutor." He stepped closer. "Say yes, Elena. Say yes to dinner and to music and to whatever this is between us." "Yes," Elena breathed. "Yes to all of it." Alexander kissed her then, there in the conservatory where their story had truly begun. It was a kiss full of promise and patience, passion finally allowed to bloom after months of careful tending. When they broke apart, Elena laughed shakily. "I can't believe this is real." "Believe it?" Alexander said, resting his forehead against hers. "We're going to write a beautiful song together, you and I." "Cheesy," Elena accused, but she was smiling. "You love it," Alexander countered. And she did. She loved his terrible jokes and his hidden kindness, and the way he played piano like he was sharing secrets. She loved that he'd seen her as more than a maid from the very beginning, that he'd recognized the music in her soul and given it space to grow. Their first official date was dinner at a small Italian restaurant, the kind of place where the owner knew everyone's name and the pasta was made fresh daily. Alexander was nervous, which Eleanor found endearing. "I haven't done this in a long time," he admitted over appetizers. "Dated, I mean. I'm probably terrible at it." "You're doing fine," Elena assured him, "though you could stop glaring at the waiter every time he refills my water. He's hovering. He's doing his job. You know, the one I used to do?" Alexander winced. "Sorry, I'm not usually the jealous type." "Liar," Eleanor said affectionately. "You're exactly the jealous type, but it's okay, I find it oddly charming." They talked for hours, no longer employer and employee, but two people discovering each other anew. Alexander told her about his plans to expand the employee scholarship program. Elena shared her dreams of composing for films, of creating music that told stories. "I want to help," Alexander said. Not with money, I know you won't accept that. But with connections. I know people in the industry. One step at a time, Elena said. Let me get through my first semester first. Fair enough. But Elena, I'm going to be your biggest cheerleader. Front row at every recital, buying every piece of sheet music you publish. I'm going to be insufferable. I'm counting on it, Elena said, taking his hand across the table. The gossip started immediately, of course. Former maid dating billionaire boss. It was exactly the kind of story the tabloids loved. But Elena had underestimated both Alexander's influence and her own strength. When a particularly nasty article came out suggesting she'd been sleeping her way to success, Alexander wanted to sue. Elena stopped him. Let them talk, she said calmly. I know the truth, you know the truth, the people who matter know the truth. The rest is just noise. Her first day at the conservatory was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. She was older than most of the students, rusty from years away from formal training. But when she sat at the piano for her placement exam and played one of her original compositions, she saw the professors exchange glances of surprise and interest. She belonged here, had always belonged here. It had just taken a broken vase and a billionaire with insomnia to get her back on track. Alexander was true to his word. He was at every recital, every student showcase. He sat in the back trying to be inconspicuous, which was impossible for a man of his presence. But Elena loved knowing he was there, her anchor in a sea of new experiences. Their relationship deepened as Elena grew into her new life. She kept her apartment, needing the independence, but spent most nights at Alexander's mansion, no longer as a maid, but as the woman who'd taught him to play with his heart. I love you, he told her one night, as they played a duet they'd composed together. I've loved you since you tried to pay for my grandmother's vase in installments. I love you too, Elena replied. I've loved you since you bandaged my hand like I was something precious. You are precious, Alexander said fiercely, the most precious thing in my life. They were an unlikely pair, the billionaire and the former maid, the CEO and the composer. But in the conservatory at the piano they were simply Alexander and Elena, two souls who'd found their harmony. A year later, Elena's first major composition was performed by the City Symphony. She sat in the audience, clutching Alexander's hand, as musicians brought her music to life on a scale she'd never imagined. That's your song, Alexander whispered as the orchestra played. Your heart, your soul, your story. Our story, Elena corrected. I couldn't have done this without you. You could have, Alexander said firmly. It might have taken longer, been harder, but you would have found a way. You're the strongest person I know. After the performance, as people congratulated her and spoke of her promising future, Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought her here, the broken vase that had started it all, the late nights cleaning houses to survive, the music she'd kept secret for so long. No regrets? Alexander asked, reading her mood as he always did. None, Elena said honestly. Every step led me here, led me to you. Later that night, in the conservatory where their love had bloomed alongside their music, Alexander got down on one knee. Elena Reyes, he said, holding out a ring that was elegant in its simplicity. Will you marry me? Will you be my partner in music and in life? Will you help me fill this empty house with love and laughter and probably way too many pianos? Yes, Eleanor said, laughing and crying simultaneously. Yes to all of it, but especially to the too many pianos. They were married 6 months later in a small ceremony in the conservatory. Elena wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit. Alexander played a piece he'd composed just for her as she walked down the aisle. There wasn't a dry eye in the house. Diego, now 18 and headed to MIT on a full scholarship, walked his sister down the aisle. You did it, Elena, he whispered. You saved us all. We saved each other, Eleanor corrected, thinking of all the people who'd helped along the way. Their wedding made headlines, of course, from maid to millionaire, a modern fairy tale. But those who really knew them understood it was more than that. It was a story about two people who'd found each other at exactly the right moment, who'd helped each other heal and grow and become who they were meant to be. Elena continued her studies, graduating with honors, and immediately beginning work on her first symphony. Alexander expanded his company's charitable work, creating programs that identified and nurtured talent in unexpected places. Together, they established a foundation that provided instruments and lessons to children who couldn't afford them. "Every child deserves the chance to find their voice," Elena said at the foundation's launch. "Music saved my life. Maybe it can save someone else's too." They had their challenges, of course. Alexander's world wasn't always welcoming to someone with Elena's background. There were whispers at galas, raised eyebrows at board meetings, but Elena had learned to hold her head high, to let her work speak for itself, and her work spoke volumes. Within 5 years, she was one of the most sought-after composers in the city. Her pieces were performed in concert halls around the world. Critics spoke of her unique voice, her ability to capture both joy and sorrow in a single phrase. But her favorite audience remained the same: Alexander, sitting at their piano, playing her latest composition, with tears in his eyes. "How do you do it?" he asked one evening. "How do you take all that pain and turn it into something so beautiful?" "The same way you took a broken company and turned it into an empire," Elena replied. "By believing that broken things can be made whole again, just differently than before." They had 2 children, Sophia, who inherited her mother's musical gift, and Gabriel, who had his father's head for business but his mother's heart for helping others. The mansion that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with music and laughter. "Tell us the story," Sophia would beg, "about how you met Daddy." So Elena would tell them about the broken vase, the bandaged hand, the secret music that brought 2 lonely people together. She told them about choosing love over fear, about second chances and unexpected gifts. "Is it true?" Gabriel would ask, skeptical even at 7. "All of it?" "Every word," Alexander would confirm, pulling his family close. Sometimes the best stories are the true ones. Years passed. Eleanor's music evolved, deepened, became richer with experience. She wrote operas and symphonies, scored films that made audiences weep, but she never forgot where she came from, never lost the hunger that had driven her to create beauty from hardship. She kept her old keyboard, the one with the sticky keys, in her studio at home. Sometimes when she was stuck on a composition, she'd play it and remember the girl who'd composed symphonies in a cramped apartment, dreaming of more. "Why do you keep that old thing?" Alexander asked once, finding her at the battered keyboard at 3 in the morning. "To remember," Eleanor said simply. "To remember that the music was always in me, even when I had nothing else. The expensive pianos, the concert halls, the recognition, those are wonderful. But the music, that was mine even when I was nobody." "You were never nobody," Alexander said fiercely, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Not to Diego, not to your grandmother, and certainly not to me." Their love story became legend in their circles: the billionaire who'd fallen for his maid's secret music, the composer who'd taught a CEO to play with his heart. But for Elena and Alexander, it was simpler than that. They were 2 people who'd been broken in different ways, who'd found in each other the missing pieces they needed to become whole. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Alexander surprised Elena with a gift that made her sob. He'd tracked down the church where she'd first learned piano, the one with the abandoned instrument in the basement. The church was being demolished, but Alexander had bought the piano, restored it to its former glory, and placed it in their conservatory. "This is where your music began," he said, as Elena ran her fingers over the keys she'd first touched at 7 years old. "I thought it should be here, where our story began too." Elena played the first song she'd ever learned on those keys, a simple hymn that had opened the door to everything that followed. Then she played the composition she'd written that morning, a complex piece that would premiere with the London Symphony next season. "Same soul," Alexander said softly, "just with more tools to express it." "Same love," Elena replied, "just with more years to deepen it." They sat together on the bench, playing a duet they'd composed for their children, a piece about finding your way home, even when you didn't know you were lost. Outside the conservatory windows, New York glittered with its million lights and million stories. But inside, there was only music and love and the quiet miracle of 2 people who'd saved each other. Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't broken that vase? Eleanor asked as they played. You would have found another way to music, Alexander said confidently, and I would have found another way to you. Some things are meant to be, Elena. We just got lucky that the universe gave us such a dramatic beginning. Dramatic beginnings make the best stories, Eleanor agreed, leaning into him as their hands danced across the keys together. Our story's not over, Alexander reminded her. We're just getting to the good part. And he was right. Their children grew up surrounded by music and love, understanding that wealth meant nothing without purpose, that talent was a gift to be shared, not hoarded. Sophia became a renowned violinist who established music programs in underserved communities. Gabriel used his business acumen to create sustainable funding for arts education. Elena's grandmother lived to see her granddaughter perform at Carnegie Hall, tears streaming down her weathered face, as the girl she'd raised played for thousands. Your parents would be so proud, she whispered afterward. You kept your promise. You took care of everyone. I had help, Elena said, glancing at Alexander, who was trying to look dignified while openly weeping with pride. Diego became the engineer he'd dreamed of being, designing concert halls that revolutionized acoustic technology. At the opening of each new venue, Elena would perform and he would say the same thing. My sister taught me that buildings are just boxes until you fill them with dreams. The foundation Alexander and Elena had started grew into a global initiative, providing instruments and instruction to millions of children. They received letters daily from kids who'd discovered their calling, from parents grateful for the chance their children had been given, from teachers who finally had the resources they needed. We did this, Elena would marvel, reading the letters in bed while Alexander worked beside her. You did this, he would correct. I just provided the funding. You provided the heart. We both provided both, Eleanor would insist, and they'd argue lovingly about it until one or both of them got distracted by other activities that required less talking. 25 years after the broken vase, they stood in the same spot where they'd first met, though the kitchen had been renovated twice since then. Eleanor was holding their first grandchild, Alexander's arms around both of them. She has your eyes, Alexander said softly, studying the baby's face. And your stubborn chin, Elena countered. God help us all. Tell her the story, Sophia urged, cradling her daughter. About the vase and the music and everything. So Elena began, as she had so many times before. Once upon a time, there was a girl who thought she was invisible and a boy who thought he was unreachable. But one night, a crystal vase shattered, and with it, all the walls between them. The baby listened with that intense focus newborns sometimes have, as if absorbing every word into her tiny soul. And maybe she was. Maybe someday she'd tell her own children about their great-grandmother, who'd turned heartbreak into symphonies, about their great-grandfather who'd learned that success meant nothing without someone to share it with. The end? Sophia asked when Elena finished. Never the end, Alexander said, kissing his wife's temple. Just the beginning of the next movement. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Elena and Alexander sat at their piano as they did every evening. They played without sheet music, letting their fingers find the melodies that lived in their shared heart. Sometimes they played Elena's compositions, sometimes they played classical pieces, sometimes they just improvised, creating music that existed only in that moment, for only them to hear. I love you, Alexander said as he did every night. Thank you for breaking my grandmother's vase. I love you too, Elena replied as she always did. Thank you for being there to catch me when I fell. They played until the city grew quiet around them, two souls who'd found their perfect harmony in the most unexpected way. And in the morning they'd wake up and do it all again, choose each other, create beauty together, prove that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin with the most ordinary moments. A broken vase, a bandaged hand, a secret song played in an empty room, and two people brave enough to believe that shattered things could be made whole again, not by putting the pieces back together, but by creating something entirely new from the fragments. That was their real secret, the one the tabloids never understood. It wasn't about the billionaire falling for the maid. It wasn't about rags to riches or fairy tale endings. It was about two people who chose to see each other, really see each other, beyond the roles life had assigned them, who chose love over fear, trust over doubt, and music over silence. Every single day, forever. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Where are you watching from? Have you ever had a moment where someone saw your hidden talent or secret self? Share in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else to take that leap of faith. And if you believe in the power of unexpected love and second chances, don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories that prove sometimes the most beautiful symphonies come from the most broken instruments. Thank you for joining me today, and remember, we all have music inside us. Sometimes we just need someone to help us find the right key.